My name is Mark Gunderson. I'm an architect in Fort Worth, although I sort of have one foot in both cities, Dallas and Fort Worth, and if not the region. I started my practice in 1985 as a sole practitioner, and having grown up in Austin in a funny kind of climate in the 1960s, never had a clear idea of what being an architect was, so I've probably invented, so I have in a funny way sort of a self-taught idea about what this practice is. But I would say I have, it may have come from my father in a way, but I have an intense love of the history of things, and it isn't strictly for the historical side in the usual sense of the word. It's because as an architect and a designer, I care about how these things have come through time, and it colors enormously the way that I would put things together. So I think that any architect who was sort of worthy of the name, in my book, would be concerned at a really detailed level with their place, with the history of the place, with the people that had gone before them, and so on, and for all those reasons. And so I've followed, in a funny kind of pinball way, over my life, various people at various times for various reasons, not in any particular chronology, not because of any certain style or whatever, just followed my heart through all that. And Howard is one of those people that if you care about a place long enough, you care about Dallas, you care about North Central Texas and why buildings look a certain way in North Central Texas versus somewhere else, you would find him. And there are those buildings, 3525 Turtle Creek or Temple Manuel, whatever, that are just the basic models for that. And then if you try, as I've often done, to sort of just saturate yourself in somebody's work, then you begin to get a real feel for who Howard was. So I never met Howard. He died after I started my practice, but then history is like that. Sometimes you overlap, sometimes you don't. There's a lot of architects I care about that are from centuries ago. There's a lot of architects that I'll never meet who I care about. And in one way, it sort of doesn't matter. I sort of have tried to absorb their work in some fashion. I never met Howard Meyer, but as an architect who had established his practice in 1985, and has a concern for not just modernism and global issues, but for regional and vernacular, you couldn't not know Howard Meyer's work. And he died then in January of 1988, and I remember reading in his obituary a comment that he had made about Le Corbusier that he could really make a square sing, and I thought, well, what a lovely thing, and it showed that we were somehow in the same sensibility of things. And at that point, if you knew anything about Meyer's work, you would know of Temple Manuel and you would know of 3525 Turtle Creek as projects. And since then, the other notable projects have sort of filled out. I know that Howard sits in that time period, as do a number of different people, architects that I care about, who were born at the turn of the 20th century. And Howard being born in 1903, I have close ties with the Kahn family, and Lou Kahn was born in 1901. They both had essentially that same upbringing architecturally, of being trained in the Beaux-Arts, and at the same time, in the late 1920s, having modernism as this compelling thing and brought in front of them, something that was the future in a way. For me, Howard sits in that sort of group of people where they were born just at the turn of the 20th century. Howard in 1903, and I'm close to the Kahn family, so I'm always sort of indexing off of Lou Kahn's life work, and Lou was born in 1901, but they're both architects who hit college education at the time when architectural education was predicated on Beaux-Arts teachings, esquisses and so on from Paris. And at the same time, the late 20s, modernism was just, through Le Corbusier and any number of others, was just sort of rearing its head. So They were caught in a funny point in architectural education where modernism was in front of them, the Beaux-Arts was behind them, and they needed to reconcile that in some way, and so life starts to get really interesting. And I think that then on top of that, when you take an architect who's already been trained in that funny sort of spot, that you bring them then to another vernacular, a regional vernacular in some way, a material palette that comes from a certain place, that really ups the ante again. Then they have to take what arguably is an abstraction in some way, modernism, a European modernism, and root it in something that has meaning for that particular place, in Howard's case, Dallas. I would say that he, of course, he did that, and you'll see strains. It's interesting to me that you don't hear much about Marcel Breuer, or you hear about Harold Hamilton Harris, other architects who I see pretty clearly in Howard's work over the years, who also sort of tried to reconcile those various influences in some way. The Beaux-Arts was a funny thing, but it was a rigorous, particularly in terms of watercolor work and having what was known as a partie, a central idea to the project. You couldn't help but understand how buildings were put together, and you didn't have the luxury that we have now of saying that the mechanical systems and the structural systems will all be dealt with by somebody else. You'd better have an idea that from the beginning, just from literally in the Beaux-Arts sense, the very first sketch had to carry all those different aspects to it. And you, as you progress through the development of a project, you use that very first sketch as not just the seed for the idea, but as a test, as a benchmark to feed back and be sure that the idea as it came to fruition, came to reality, still had those original ideas in it in some way. So that again is something that's really being lost. The computer as a tool just is not particularly good at any of those things. So Howard followed again a sort of Beaux-Arts idea about the grand tour when he graduates from college in 1928. He does exactly what the Beaux-Arts indicated. You go to Europe and you go see all of the master works. Although, in addition to doing that, he searched out, as did a number of people, Le Corbusier and the other modernists at the time, and he was very successful in seeing, in a few months period, a lot of the modernist works. Particularly, he was influenced by housing in Germany and so on, the housing projects. He knew the work of Aud and other architects that, if you were to become familiar with the Bauhaus, you'd know were in practice at that time. And so it was a pretty rigorous, I would say Howard began at Columbia at 16 years old. He started high school at 14. He was a very sharp person. So he was attuned to all of that. And that's the quality that he brought to Dallas in 1935, which, as fate would have it, Louis Hexter, who came to have a title company in Dallas, was his college roommate, or was a fraternity brother at Columbia. And Hexter's, the house never materialized, but Hexter's circle of friends, as with Howard's wife Sean's family friends, put him in the middle of a really rich cultural context in Dallas. That is, a group of predominantly Jewish merchants whose names, Sanger, Zale, and so on, you would know to this day as being some of the largest department stores and so on, and the Sanger, Harris family and so on. Which made, in Texas at least, almost the only clientele that an architect really can work with at that time. It's almost a cliche that architects start with houses for doctors and so on, the sort of clientele that can afford to pay an architect. And Texas certainly wasn't exactly ripe for modernism, although he hit that at exactly the right moment as well. This opportunity to come to Texas in 1935 to work for Louis Hexter, when that didn't happen, it's put him in the center of all the work being done for Fair Park for the Texas Centennial of 1936, which is terribly interesting group of Dallas architects, George Dahl and others, who Roscoe DeWitt, who play a part for the next several decades in also ushering modernism to the Dallas region, including another person you sort of don't hear much of, but Donald Barthelm, who was a designer in DeWitt's office, who worked on other buildings at Fair Park and wound up in Houston. His son became one of the most noted postmodernist writers in the literary scene. But in any case, I say that just to point out that there's this incredible sort of lineage through his clientele that always kept him in some level of work, even when things were really tough. And this came to include Temple Emmanuel, which, whether you think of it as a masterpiece or not, certainly embodies all of those qualities that the Bauhaus and early modernists intended, where from the smallest objects to the landscape, it's a seamless transition of design, and you don't make distinctions between interior design and architecture and landscape work. It's all one thing. And if Temple Emmanuel has any qualities, it's that which are also reinforced by Georgie Kepish and other people that were involved in that project, who had literally taught at Bauhaus and brought that same sensibility to the work. So it's a rare thing in Texas, and you could easily put Temple Emmanuel as one of the best buildings in the state for that reason, for its concerns at every level, in every aspect, from the trees in the parking lot to the gold inlay tiles in the back wall of the sanctuary. The 20th century is fraught with that whole idea of art history and following architecture through styles and so on. And so this whole issue of modernism versus Beaux-Arts or whatever, at the time that Howard was alive, is still being thought of as styles, as though things are in boxes and you just work in the next style and it's on top of it. The idea that an architect might wake up in the morning and just take the materials at hand with the sensibility that he has at that given moment and simply work and simply design towards a certain kind of beauty is something that's, I don't know why that's so hard for people to imagine, but it seems to be. The general public, I think, has the idea that that an architect wakes up in the morning and picks a style and decides what style to apply to a box that's already there in some way, which is not really true. And so I think that while you can say that Howard is one of those architects that brought modernism to Texas and to Dallas in particular, in a certain way, I think it's more elegant to say that he simply tried to work in the sensibility of the moment. And part of that goes back to the retail side of things and the community that he was working in, which had extreme aspirations for quality in things. And modernism to that group of people was a concern for quality, if nothing else. And so he was sort of the perfect fit for that. In other words, if you were going to build a house and you wanted the best, whatever that meant to you, if you wanted the best house that you could build, you didn't guess styles. It was a modern house. It was just a given that modernism was the best work that you could do, which was counter to most of what Texas believed at the time. And certainly even now, we still have issues about all that, about whether modernism is a style and a dead thing, and you're just using what in a knee-jerk kind of way is old versus new, whether you're working in some new idea versus some more traditional thing. The real estate team seems to have taken all this apart, and the general level of conversation is really low about that sort of thing. But Howard nonetheless embodied this this ability to sort of bring all those different aspects together and keep the best parts of tradition, while at the same time working in a set of materials or construction tectonics and so on that reflect his moment and not looking back on something else. Harwell Hamilton Harris or other architects who